Apollo Saturn V, designed to propel the United States manned lunar landing mission. 3 million parts from the labor of people at 20,000 companies, universities, and government facilities. A first stage assembled in Louisiana, using parts from Kansas, Missouri, Washington, and many other states. A second stage shipped to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida through the Panama Canal from California, with a stopover in Mississippi for testing. A third stage flown from California to Florida. An instrument unit from Alabama. The spacecraft came from factories in Oklahoma, New York, and California, and electronic systems came from such widely separated sources as Massachusetts and Wisconsin. Major equipment to prepare, test, launch, guide, track, and recover the spacecraft are the products of Minnesota, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Ohio, Tennessee, and other states. The Apollo 4 mission, unmanned, first flight for Apollo Saturn V, was launched into Earth orbit November 9, 1967. The Saturn V and its spacecraft stand as high as a 36-story building, and at liftoff weigh more than a U.S. Navy destroyer. Its Earth orbital payload is 10 tons greater than John Glenn's entire Mercury Atlas space vehicle of 1962. It is moved from its assembly building by a massive crawler transporter over a roadway designed to handle the combined weight of more than 12 million pounds. It is watched over in minute detail by an extraordinarily complex array of facilities. It answers to a chain of electronic eyes and ears that circle the world. And it flies a course dictated by an assembly of advanced computers. It is the result of the work of some 300,000 Americans in the disciplines of science, engineering, technology, and management. The entire space vehicle was to be launched in the first mission, rather than follow the step-by-step approach of earlier programs. A view of the Earth from the North Pole shows the planned course of Apollo. 2 circular orbits and 1 elliptical orbit. In addition to the liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center, the first, second, and third stage burns and insertion into circular orbit. Other high points of the mission were the reignition of the third stage over the western Atlantic, the first spacecraft propulsion system burn over the eastern Atlantic, an 11,000-mile peak altitude over the Indian Ocean during the elliptical orbit, the second and longest spacecraft propulsion system burn over the western Pacific, the re-entry, and finally a landing in the Pacific a few hundred miles northwest of Hawaii. During the 25,000-mile-per-hour re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, the spacecraft was to be guided, as in the lunar mission, along a roller coaster flight path, heating as it encountered the atmosphere, cooling as it climbed back toward space, reheating as it again plunged into the atmosphere for the final descent. Countdown for the launch started at the Kennedy Space Center at 6 a.m., November 7, 1967, with liftoff scheduled for precisely 49 hours later. Inexorably, launch operations moved forward. Minor problems were encountered, but readily solved. Apollo 4 was tested more persistently than any previous American space vehicle. There were no indications of systems malfunctions. The countdown delays, so familiar in the early missions of previous programs, did not occur. Almost exactly as planned, Apollo 4 lifted off at 1 second after 7 o'clock, November 9th, 1967, with its first stage delivering 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Two minutes and 32 seconds later, as scheduled, the first stage burned out and separated, having consumed 4.5 million pounds of fuel. The separation and second stage ignition were also recorded by cameras carried on board the vehicle, 40 miles above the Earth. The camera gave engineers a close-up look at another event, the separation of the interstage structure. This was critically important because clearances were extremely small between the structure and the engines. Shown in animation, the second stage performed perfectly for more than 6 minutes. A source of major developmental problems, the stage propelled Apollo 4 to an altitude of more than 100 miles. Like the first stage, the second stage cut off and separated almost exactly on schedule. The third stage ignited and inserted Apollo 4 into a circular orbit, where it would remain for some 3 hours. In slightly more than 11 minutes, Apollo 4 proved out Saturn stages that had required years to develop. But the mission had over 8 hours to go. Now the orbiting Apollo 4 had to be checked out remotely in anticipation of the next series of events, and ground support facilities had to be evaluated. Flight controllers had to prepare the third stage for its first reignition in space, a capability which must be proved for the Apollo lunar mission. One of the few irregularities of the entire flight occurred at this point, when data suggested that a valve on the Saturn V third stage had not closed as planned for the reignition. But technical skill paid off. The flight controllers quickly revised the pre-ignition sequence to compensate for the potential problem. The third stage was fired as scheduled, propelling Apollo 4 into its elliptical orbit. "5 minutes and 25 seconds later, the stage shut down. Saturn V, whose guidance computer had made over 300 million calculations since liftoff, had placed the spacecraft on course. The third stage and a test model of the spacecraft lunar module fell away. The launch vehicle had done its job. A few moments later, the spacecraft's own propulsion system ignited and burned for 16 seconds, giving the spacecraft the velocity necessary to reach a peak altitude of more than 11,000 miles. The spacecraft was oriented so that its heat shield was shaded from the sun, soaking in a temperature 150 to 200 degrees below zero. The contrast between this cold temperature and the extremely high temperatures of re-entry would put the heat shield to an especially severe test. As Apollo 4 climbed, a camera pointing out the spacecraft window photographed part of what a future Apollo command pilot will see of our planet. These photographs were selected from a series shot every 11.4 seconds during a 2-hour, 12-minute period as the Earth passed in front of the spacecraft window. Apollo 4 reached 11,232 miles above the Indian Ocean at 5 hours, 46 minutes, 48 seconds after liftoff, and began its descent to Earth, responding to the pull of gravity, increasing in velocity as if it were speeding down a long hill. Some 2 hours, 20 minutes later, the spacecraft propulsion system again ignited, burning this time for 4.5 minutes. This burn accelerated the spacecraft toward a re-entry into the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, the speed anticipated for the re-entry of the Apollo lunar mission. The command module, which would contain the flight crew in a manned mission, was separated, then oriented with its heat shield forward. At about 8 hours, 40 minutes after liftoff, Apollo 4 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Temperatures on the heat shield, which was less than 3 inches thick, soon reached 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was 1,000 degrees hotter than the launch pad flame bucket when Apollo 4 lifted off. Yet the temperature inside the command module never exceeded 70 degrees. Could we have seen the actual command module on its path toward Earth, it would have resembled a meteorite from space. The command module splashed into the Pacific Ocean within sight of its recovery ship, the USS Bennington. Although charred, the 5.5-ton command module, like the entire 3,000-ton Apollo Saturn V, had passed the test. Further, the chain of ground facilities and the launch and flight teams had shown themselves equal to the task. Some 8.5 hours after Apollo 4 roared off the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center, the mission ended. The road to the moon is a long and difficult one, and the flight of Apollo 4 is a successful beginning.
This is Apollo 5, the first all-up unmanned flight test for the lunar module, the spacecraft in which man will make his first landing on the moon, the final major piece of Apollo hardware to be tested. Now the lunar module, dubbed LM-1, sits in its protective technological cocoon atop the tested and proven Saturn 1B launch vehicle, waiting for the boost into the environment for which it was designed, space. It will not return to Earth, but will continue in a gradually decaying orbit until it re-enters and burns up. In the blockhouse at Cape Kennedy, the men have assembled to do the job. From Marshall Space Flight Center, from the Kennedy Space Center, and from the Manned Spacecraft Center, they have come to get the mission into orbit.
RTC will use Site Select, Guido, GNC, and ECOM to Mila.
In Mission Control in Houston, flight controllers wait to take over command of the mission as soon as it lifts off the pad. Among these men are 4 who watch with special interest. Astronauts Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweikert, who are scheduled to fly the first manned lunar module. And in a support room next to the control room, astronauts Frank Borman and Bill Anders, who will fly the lunar module on its rehearsal of the first manned lunar mission.
Go flight. GNC. Go flight. Procedures. Go flight. AFD. Go. Network. Go flight. Computer soup. Go flight. RTC, you on AFD conference. RTC's on AFD conference. Roger. Best of luck. Number 2 is go. Okay, go ahead and reload. All flight controllers preconditioned for attachment 2 of the internal count.
So men wait in tracking stations around the world for the flight of lunar module number 1, for it is their information that will tell us whether it is safe for man. But what is this craft called the lunar module?
LM is a vehicle that has been designed for a particular job, and that job is to land on the lunar surface. It doesn't look like an airplane or a spacecraft in the old sense. It's not smooth. Very thin skin, has a descent propulsion stage, a large descent engine which will be used to land the vehicle on the lunar surface in a manner very similar to that of a helicopter, except that instead of using blades for a lift, we'll be using a rocket propulsion engine. And the upper stage, the cabin and ascent engine stage, will be used to lift off from the lunar surface and make the subsequent rendezvous with the command and service module.
So the LM is really the taxi that provides the transportation between the orbiting command module and the lunar surface.
The lunar module is a unique engineering concept. Designed and built on Earth, it is out of place on its native planet. The airless surface of the moon, the empty reaches of space, this is where it belongs. The comfortable pull of Earth's gravity, the protective, life-giving atmosphere, these, to the lunar module, nicknamed LEM, are the hostile elements. Its engines cannot lift its own weight against the pull of the Earth. If it could fly on Earth, the aerodynamic forces of the atmosphere would tear it apart. So how do you test the lunar module before it flies in space? You test its engines in the man-made vacuum of an engine test stand. Its operating systems in gigantic vacuum chambers. You tumble it on stands in engineering laboratories. But the real test is when it flies.
Roger, I am in flight control. Final status check, booster. Go. Retro. Go. FIDO. Go. Guidance. Go. Econ. Go.
While the primary instructions for the mission are carried on board the LEM, the men on Earth in mission control can take over and fly it if necessary. But why all these elaborate precautions and details in an unmanned flight?
Unmanned LEM-1 mission is one of the key missions in the entire lunar landing program. You must remember that the LEM is every bit as important as spacecraft as the command module, the Gemini, or the Mercury was, and this is the first flight of the vehicle. Naturally, we'll all be looking at it with very, very keen interest.
Flight CVTS Black 2, verify your go for launch.
Roger, we are go for launch. Okay, all flight controllers, let's play it cool.
Launch sequence start. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, ignition detected.
Transmit 5 enter.
Clock start, 5 enter.
Thrust okay.
Affirmative.
Program 11.
Okay, TLK P11.
Roll pitch start.
Roll and pitch. Go on IP. Go IP. Stand by for nose.
The launch and insertion into Earth orbit are on the nose.
Cutoff plus 50.
Roger, cutoff plus 50.
The aerodynamic shroud is jettisoned.
Roger, nose cap jet.
Now the next critical step, the opening of the protective metallic petals and the separation of Lunar Module 1 from its cocoon.
RTC booster, transmitting slot deploy. Roger. We are transmitting slot deploy. Okay, all flight controllers, we have slot deploy A and B relay indications, no physical monitor indication.
Everything is nominal.
We get a go for separation.
On schedule, the reaction control engines of Lunar Module 1 pull it free of its protective cocoon. The space butterfly rests its wings before it flies. Now begins the long coast preparatory to the first firing of the descent engine. While the LEM coasts, tracking stations pinpoint its position and determine its orbit with accuracy. In Houston Mission Control, engineers are testing the many systems on board.
The LEM, I think, is like a big line of dominoes, every one of which has an effect upon the one it's associated with. And nothing can occur in one that doesn't somehow affect the others or the total mission.
So, LEM 1 coasts on, guided by its onboard programmer, seen only by the radar eyes of the tracking network, watched over by the men in mission control.
We will not pulse the engine. The maneuver is go at this time based on the onboard. Roger, Houston. Roger, Houston is go for the burn.
The lunar module nears the Australian coast. The Carnarvon tracking station takes command. The time is nearing for the first burn of the descent engine, the first rocket engine designed to be throttled, a necessary feature for a lunar landing. This will be its first burn in space.
Mark, predicted ignition.
Tips on.
Tips on.
10%.
10%.
Tone.
We got a pings caution. Program caution.
Roger.
Tips off.
But something goes wrong. Instead of the full 38-second burn, the engine shuts down after only 4 seconds. An early look at the data indicates the onboard computer did not allow for the tolerances and errors within this most complex of all missions. It shut down the descent engine when it sensed an error of less than 1.5 seconds, and computers don't argue.
Capability of a crew, I think, is very significant in that you can change your mind in flight. You don't have to be restricted by the rather narrow capabilities of any pre-programmed mission.
Faced with the unexpected, the computer made the only decision it could, and it was the wrong one. Now the success of the mission rests squarely on the team in mission control and in the tracking stations. The nominal plan is out the window. On communications lines all over the world, the alternates are discussed. But the final word must come from Flight Director Gene Kranz.
I guess our best plan here, and I think the way we're going to go is alternate Charlie. Go ahead. In the attitude you've got. Go ahead. At 6:15 elapsed. Go ahead. Okay.
The long throttle burn of the descent engine would be cut to 2 minutes and occur during its pass over the United States. Then the descent engine would go to 100% thrust preparatory for the biggest test of the mission, fire in the hole.
Let's suppose that we're descending using the descent engine and suddenly we discover some fault in the descent or the ascent stage for that matter. Well, we would like to return to a safe lunar orbit. So what we would do is essentially abort, fire the ascent stage while it's still connected to the descent stage, and then milliseconds later fire the pyros that separate the two stages.
Roger, you have dips arm.
We show the ignition discrete. We show front chamber pressure. Front chamber pressure is gone. We're burning, the rates are good. It's a good burn. We go.
Over California now, up and down the power scale. The first rocket engine capable of controlled variations of its propulsion force is passing the test. This is the time of maximum stress on the lunar module and on the men, flight controllers, astronauts, and engineers, to whom Lunar Module 1 represents years of their professional lives. And now there is another factor. A second test for the ascent stage is a burn to depletion of its propellant. This was to come one orbit after fire in the hole to test the restart capability of the engine. Now, if it looks critical, this burn will be combined with fire in the hole.
Max thrust.
Raj.
Launch stage.
Staging. Raj, staging. Apps on. Okay, let's watch this. We got 60 seconds. Let's make a good go-no-go here.
Flight fighter, we're looking at White Sands track. It is good. It's solid. We're go.
The burn is good. Lunar Module 1 is performing fantastically well as a spacecraft. The shutdown order is given after 60 seconds of ascent burn. Now it is time for the burn to depletion. However, as the lunar module continues its flight, the Earth has rotated under it until it has moved nearly off the tracking range. LEM 1 will now pass over only one station, Hawaii, that can give the new and accurate information its computer needs, and can command the engine to restart. It looks like on the coming pass, Hawaii will send the update, and on the next, send the command signal. But now another problem crops up.
Flight, we're going to run out of RCS and B here the way we're going.
Okay, Jack, let's stay cool.
Because of the new mode of flight, the Attitude rockets are running low on propellant. It looks as though these small but critical engines may not last for 2 more orbits. But an update of orbit information shows that Lunar Module 1 will just pass within range of the Carnarvon station, whose range has been extended by the addition of the tracking ship Coastal Sentry Quebec, CSQ. Flight Director Kranz makes his decision. Update at Carnarvon and fire at Hawaii. It's go for the burn.
Guidance from flight, we're having a lot of dropouts.
Roger, flight.
ECOM, let him know when he's clear to command again. Go.
But the pass over Carnarvon is too short. The full update does not get to the lunar module, including an instruction that would have drained some of the propellant from the ascent engine tanks into the tanks of the Attitude rockets. Without this propellant, it is doubtful if the final ascent burn can be ignited. Now it gets tight. Tank pressure is just enough. It has to be this orbit. The flight team is under the gun. Kranz's plan is time critical. The rest of the information will be sent up early during the Hawaii pass. After a quick guidance check, the ascent propulsion system will be fired. The signal to ignite the engine is PRA-5.
Jeff, clock and compare pulses.
That's negative, Flight. We got a spacecraft reject on that. We don't show any clock compare pulses, Flight.
Retransmit. Guidance execute PRA start.
It's go. The burn works.
Okay,
And at shutdown, it holds.
You got it?
All systems are still operating as expected, beyond what was expected.
Flight, you got a transmit mag selector for me?
It's been a tremendous test of the engine, and that's what it was all about.
Do you want me to stand by here?
Negative, you've done it all, and good work, Gary. Beautiful job.
Throughout the flight of Apollo 5, the lunar module had performed magnificently. All systems operated either as predicted or far exceeded the predictions. The inability of an onboard computer to cope with a programming error was overcome by the infinitely more flexible mind of man. Hundreds of additional commands sent from Earth put the lunar module through a demanding real-time test. So, Lunar Module 1 tumbles on through space, its orbit decaying mathematically until it is destroyed by the atmosphere of an Earth on which it was created, but to which it cannot return. Lunar Module 1 was the first space test of a manned vehicle designed to explore another world. This was the flight of the machine. Soon, it will be time for man.